Good afternoon and welcome to You and Your Business with me, Alec Drew on 103.2 Dublin City FM. Each week, I invite an expert from the world of business to share their knowledge, insights, and tips to help you with your business challenges. If there's a topic you would like covered or if you feel you can make a contribution, please email me at yourbusiness@dublincityfm.ie and perhaps we'll be having a chat here one day soon. And my guest today is a former session musician. He's an expert on compliance and standards, and he helps tender teams to be compliant in their bids. I'm delighted to welcome Phil Byrne to the You and Your Business studio. Hiya, Phil.
Hi, hello to everybody. Thanks for Alec.
Yeah, great, Phil. I am going to take you back all those years to last year in school. Were you the academic? Were you the musician? What were you? And had you a plan in place to move your career forward?
Okay, so I was one of the lucky ones in my last year in school because at the end of fifth year during the summer, I did an exam for a competition and got selected for an internship with back then an early participant in the software engineering world.
Wow.
And you know the that was what attracted me at the time. In the school I was in, we studied computers for the leaving cert, and it was the thing. It was everybody was going to be a computer expert. But I trained as a systems analyst with a company called System Dynamics, and they're
Right.
still in existence on John Rogerson's Quay. Learned a lot. They placed me in a number of good customers of theirs to work with over a period of a couple of years. But eventually the music took hold, and I was drawn away by an opportunity in London at the time.
All right, so the lure of the bright lights got to you, so you went to London.
Well, you got to remember, well, I had hair then, right? And there was that whole rock thing going on with, you had, yes, you had the pop thing, of course, but for blues and rock fans, it was an era where, guitar music was just ubiquitous. It was everywhere. And I suppose every aspiring guitar player wanted to be Eddie Van Halen or Angus Young or whatever. So it was off to London. I went to play with a band and tour in support of an American rock band that were visiting the UK at the time. It was interesting, but changed the direction. It was totally unexpected, and it changed the direction I was traveling in. Yeah,
I'd say it did. I mean, we're talking about computer science to playing on
yeah,
the
yeah. Yeah.
stage to the crowd. Tell me about your experience. I mean, there must have been a lot of life lessons to be learned from sort of touring with a band.
Well, number one is it's not all it's cracked up to be. Um,
Right.
it's hard work. Uh, there's a 90-minute show can take weeks of planning and rehearsing, and you don't just turn up on stage and play with other musicians, even though you might all know the songs. Getting to know each other and learning each other's timing and everything else is very important. But I think the experience is the same in any team environment, really. If you have to work together,
Sure.
and you have to be all on that single focus of what the result is going to be. So it's like, it's like trying to talk to a businessman. Don't be focusing on engaging with the client all the time.
Yeah.
Focus on what that leads to, the invoice. Right? Really, it's about the money, isn't it? You can love what you do all you want, but you have to make a living at the same time, and you have to turn around.
I think it's a secret, though, that so many people take for granted that they see somebody performing or a band performing, and there's presumption, my goodness, they just do it naturally, but they don't see the hard work that goes in behind it.
Well, you've got to realize that, when I was at school, there were times when people would throw pebbles up at my bedroom window. Are you coming out? Game of football? No, playing guitar, right? Why? Because I had to learn parts for a gig at the weekend in the Bag It
Right.
In or whatever when it existed. So, my teenage years were very much the tension between, if you like, wanting to be part and be part of the group from the mates and everything else, but also going into the old, and for those who remember Aidan Walsh and Paddy Dunning in Lytton Lanes, if you're listening to this, get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. You
Right.
know, there was a rehearsal studio in Litton Lane, and it was right beside the Hare Krishna temple.
All right.
And we used to go into the Hare Krishna temple at 12 o'clock when we were rehearsing for the free dal and rice. Nothing religious about it. The monks knew this, right? But yeah, and there was Fat Freddy's Pizza across the way, you know, when you had a few bob in your pocket. But yeah, you're talking about a time when Temple Lane was literally full of cobbled streets, old Temple Bar area. And the place was alive with this kind of bohemian attitude, with musicians everywhere, all making no money, you know. There's a famous expression for jazz people out there: is play jazz and starve. You know, it's but there are a lot of musicians who are making great livings and so on. But for every one of those, there's 1,000 who are just about cutting it, and that's evident even today. You know.
Yeah, and I mean it's across every industry you look at, or every sport even. If there'll be 1,000 players for every one good one.
Yeah, yeah.
But this music was going to take you to London, so that must have been an exciting time.
It was. I mean, it took me further afield as well. You know, for about 4 years, I was pretty much full time at it.
Hmm.
But it was really session work. You know, played through a couple of agencies and did everything from filling in for people who are missing, or playing in backing bands for singer front people, and doing radio jingles for TV ads and radio ads and so on. When you're told, okay, we've got 40 seconds, right? Go. And yeah, there were all kinds of interesting things. But at the end of the day, it's a business, you know. And I think the biggest thing that you know, the reason why I kind of still have an interest, and I still play at jazz festivals and so on, but really and truly, there was that I needed stability, you know. And I had a new wife, early 90s, going off for 6 weeks on a tour around Europe or whatever, with a support tour, maybe, where you're going to make good money. But as I kind of said to people before, you know, the stability wasn't there. You couldn't go and get a mortgage, that kind of erratic income. 1 minute you were loaded, next minute you were just about cutting it. So it was brilliant. Met some excellent people, met a couple of heroes of mine in the music world, you know. Only for I was active in it, I would never have had the opportunity to meet them. And I think being able to compare notes with your hero and them saying to you in response, hey, I really, show me that thing again, where I get to show them something, you know. And but I think every musician plagiarizes their heroes, and you come up with your own version of it. And sometimes if your hero hears it back, it doesn't sound the same thing that they come up with, but it's interesting to them, you know. But very enjoyable. But as I said, moved on from there.
Inconsistent in terms of its delivery. And if you're just joining us now, you're listening to You and Your Business with me, Alec Drew, on 103.2 Dublin City FM, where my studio guest today is Phil Byrne. Okay, Phil, now that you've enjoyed the music sensation and touring, you needed a real job. So tell us where you were lured off to get that real job.
Yeah, well, I did have that training, you see, so I could rely on the fact that I had number one, a solid education and a good leaving cert.
Right.
Then a good internship, produced the training, all certified and everything else, with great experience in a particular area that was growing. So there was an appetite, right, for people who had the skills I had. So it didn't take too long before I found a place with a consulting firm and they were, again, that same kind of thing. My job was to go in and establish the business rules, and then come back to the boffins in the room with no windows for them to program up some brand new software initiative.
Right.
So the modern software packages that you take off your shelf, you know, for enterprise management systems and so on. Well, it was in those days, all of those types of applications were built from scratch.
Right.
And it was to go in and establish the business rules for large companies, like, for example, would have worked with British Airways, would have worked with Cadbury's in the UK, you know, just doing mundane, setting up payroll software and things like that. But you've got to remember that prior to coming in with digital software, you had punch card technology, right? Which I suppose was, the punch cards were being read by computers. It was computer, but it wasn't digital.
Right.
The sensor picked up a hole in a card, and there that meant something. And I think those organizations with large workforces were the type of organizations I worked with. But as time went on, we were dealing with smaller and smaller and smaller companies, because
Right.
all of a
Okay.
sudden became accessible to them. Yeah. So yeah, into software engineering and into consulting with firms on that whole area.
Yeah, and you were talking about systems analysis, but you went working with a beer distribution company, and
Well,
that
you see,
presented a new challenge to you.
well, they wanted software too, right? So they had a supply chain which involved importing a lot of unusual beers from all over the world: Australia, Japan, Mexico. In fact, they had a cider from Mexico, which was unusual,
Right.
if I can remember correctly, Simpatico. So I don't mean to advertise it. I don't think you can even get it in Ireland, but I think
Right.
this particular company specialized in, people might remember the term yuppie from the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
So they specialized in distributing to all of the restaurants and bars that would be on that higher end. And they weren't large enough or noticeable enough to
Hmm.
be going into the big kind of supply chain like Oddbins and the Tesco's and your Waitrose over in the UK. But they were looking to go there.
Sure.
So they obtained investments, serious investment to scale up, which allowed them to, secure much more product in Japan. And if you've anybody doing business with Japan knows, you don't get credit from the Japanese. You pay
No.
for everything before it leaves the port. End of story, right? So you've got to get your credit here from the banks or whatever. So scaling up was for anyone who wanted to grow in that business. When you're talking about, think about the cost of a case of beer, and think then about maybe somewhere in the region of 10,000 cases of beer in a container, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
now you're talking about serious money to land a container in Ireland or in the UK. So to ramp up, then they had to secure contracts. And all of this required logistics, and all of it required some way of managing all of those logistics, and
Right.
software was the way they chose. So I was put in with that company for, I suppose I was there for nearly a year, working with that beer distribution company. And they have drinks, they have waters and other things going as well. But essentially, you know, the music was still attractive to me, so I kept my hand in. But there was, in London at that time, we're talking about approaching 92, 93, the whole dynamic of living in London for me was changing, because I had a new wife and a young child. And I also had that thinking about, well, I was just mid-late 20s at that time. And I was thinking, okay, so I've been having a good time for the last few years. I'm in stable work now, but it's just not really going anywhere.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
challenging, and
yeah,
that's the
yeah,
important thing. They
yeah.
also threw in something for you there, which I think people will resonate with now, but wouldn't have been aware with, and this is ISO
Yes.
9001, which was kind of a new revelation in something.
ISO 9001 came into being in 1987, which, while I was with that beer distribution company, the owner of it threw it on my desk. So that would have been 1988.
Right.
And leading up to mid 89, I would have worked with them on their software, but also making sure that it was aligned to that standard at the same time. So when that project finished, it had been very successful, and I felt and was rewarded for having a leading role in the implementation of a management system in preparation for audit. But one of the things and the feedback I had was that, actually I was a good consultant. And in
Mm.
fact, then, moved more in the direction of consulting towards those achieving standards. By 1993, my wife and I decided to move back to Ireland. And
Right. Okay.
the company I was working with put me out on garden leave.
All right.
Well, for 12 months, I couldn't work with a competitor, which meant basically I couldn't do the only thing I knew how to do, really, right?
Right.
So two things happened. I went and I qualified as a lead auditor, And while I did have an allowance on garden leave, a lot of people would say it was handsome, but when you're paying mortgages and things like that, it wasn't so handsome, right? And I needed to have some work. So I trained as a lead auditor, and I started to work as a panel auditor with a couple of certification bodies in Ireland and the UK. So my hand was definitely firmly in the standards market. And at the same time, I went back to college in DIT, Angel Street, and subjected myself to another 3 years of study beyond what I'd done already. So I think, the whole area of standards was new to me, but it was new to industry as well. And not all industry, there were other standards, technical standards available, particularly for manufacturing. But from a perspective of management system standards, ISO 9001 came in at a time where formal tendering markets were developing.
Right.
And those larger companies who were outsourcing the delivery of services to them, like contract cleaning and security provision and product supply, particularly into food and medical supply chains. Well, those large organizations wanted some assurance from their smaller suppliers. And the way that they received that was by the smaller supplier presenting with an ISO 9001 certificate, right?
Right.
And I suppose from there, as an auditor, because I was an auditor, that gave me, an attractiveness, if you like, to companies who needed some consultancy. So I started off consulting as an independent in the mid 90s, and it's growing from there. It's not the type of business that can grow rapidly. I could have decided to consult in other areas where there might have been a scope to employ a lot of people. Right. But standards, working with standards has a limitation, and that is we are kind of firmly footed in that B2B market where formal tendering takes place. And otherwise, there would be no pressure on these smaller companies to achieve that level of best practice.
All right. And if you're just joining us now, you're listening to You and Your Business with me, Alec Drew, on 103.2 Dublin City FM, where my studio guest today is Phil Byrne. Actually, Phil, you've touched on something. We're talking about standards and processes. And I remember, again, running an SME type business, and one of our large clients was looking for us to achieve ISO. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, what a nuisance. But it was only many years later that I appreciated what it was about. Maybe talk to our listeners about, because people hear standards and compliance and ISO, but they actually don't know how it integrates into delivering real value within a business.
Well, you kind of have to go back to the formation of ISO in the first place. So firstly, it's something I don't often do, but just to explain, it's not ISO, right? It's ISO. So if you remember back to school, you remember the isosceles triangle?
Yeah.
Well, that isos bit is the Greek word for equal.
All right.
But ISO was adopted by the International Organization for Standardization.
Right.
As their brand. And the implication is that everyone who achieves an ISO standard are on an equal playing field.
Right.
Right. So point of fact is that really when all of those countries came together, they committed to a couple of things. They committed to a national authority for standards. And we're talking about, in those days, I think there were 50 countries came together. Now it's 160. Right. And with about 11 or 12 kind of apprentice, observing countries, if you like, who are scheduled to become full members. To become a full member, they have to establish an accreditation body that's funded and supported by government.
Right.
They also have to contribute to the development of standards. So I play a large part there. I'm on 3 different committees to do with quality, risk, and corporate governance.
Right.
Multi-management standards committee, in fact. So my understanding of standards from its inception back then, 70 or 80 years ago nearly, is that the whole thing was brought together to provide governments with a framework for legislation. And in particular, if you think about, for example, recently we have new legislation coming in for the protected disclosures or whistleblowers legislation. But if you go back to 2005, ISO provided a new standard, ISO 27001,
Right.
as a framework for future legislation. And so all of the EU countries in 2017 adopted ISO 27001 as the national standard for data protection, with the knowledge that GDPR was coming in the following year.
Right.
So the relationship between compliance with national legislation and European directives and ISO standards is intrinsic. You can't separate them.
Right.
Sorry, Alex, go ahead. Alec, go
Yeah,
ahead.
no. I think from the sort of the SME business owners, what's not appreciated is sort of at the backbone of a lot of this is you need to have processes in place, and then those processes are followed consistently, and
Yes.
any sort of blips in them are notified and identified.
Well, I'd even simplify it further than that.
Good.
Right? Because you see, really and truly, a lot of people see ISO standards as being process driven, and in fact, an organization is process driven, not the standard, right?
Yes.
So what the standard is looking for you to do is to nail your processes, right?
Mm.
But not from the perspective of producing SOPs, standard operating procedures, or
Yeah.
documents to tell people how to do things. That's a misunderstanding. And if anybody has a standard in where that's how they prepared, well, it's a misconception. Really, what we're looking to do is to provide enough information to people operating in these processes to give them an understanding of what their responsibilities are in relation to control. In other words, an auditor going in to audit to ISO 9001 or 27001 or any other standard isn't looking to see if you've told everyone how to do something that they already should know how to do, right?
Right.
So I call it the cup of tea principle, because if you have an engineer doing a very complex task or designing, building drawings from architectural drawings, for example, well, to that particular architect or engineer, preparing those drawings is the equivalent of making a cup of tea to them. They
Yes.
already know how to do all of the stuff. But there may be a couple of issues or risks because of the nature of the relationship with the client, because
Right.
of the legislation in the jurisdiction, because of physical or health and safety hazards that might be, part and parcel of doing that work. And that's where you're asked to provide instruction around what you're responsible for with regard to those risks and controls that are established. So really, to simplify it then, is it's all about setting up monitoring so that performance data can be reported to provide for evidence-based decision making.
Right.
So really, it's removing the hunch, the gut from management decision making, and providing a way of delivering the information you need to make good decisions in a timely manner.
Right. I suppose in the 3 minutes that we've got left here, of course, I'll get you to tell our audience where they can find out more about you. Well, what do you think is the key focus for sort of SME type business going forward? I mean, GDPR has often been talked about, and I know you're heavily involved in that as well. But maybe, as I said in the 3 minutes, give me a couple of minutes of where people should be focused and how they can benefit from your sort of knowledge and skill set.
Okay, so I think being certified to ISO standards has its own market, if you like. Those who need it know they need it because their market is putting pressure on them to get it, whether it be their customers or whether it be a requirement in law, for example, if you're in medical devices manufacturing or that kind of thing. And what you'd be looking to do is use ISO standards as a framework. But for certain organizations, as I mentioned, that might be mandatory, right? So essentially, it's not for everybody, is the point, the full
Right.
certification. However, in particular, where you've got a lot of organizations that are narrow in their scope of competency, I don't mean to be I don't mean to come across as in any way disparaging of that. But you take, for example, an architect or an engineer or a carpenter or an electrician, an accountant, a lawyer. They've done a lot of good work in academic fields to study, to be experts in their discipline, and probably years of experience working in that field. But when have they had any management training?
Right.
When have they got to understand what compliance is about? Right? When have they studied risk management and how to apply it to their business? So really, I think a lot of businesses exist with no general management competency in the management team. So there's an attractiveness there in the standards to provide a framework for best practice in management that's been agreed globally.
Right.
So from my perspective, who should be looking at standards and who would benefit from talking to us? Those people who have that need to demonstrate conformance. In other words, they're going for e-tenders or government procurement or procurement systems into corporates, and they've got to respond to a request for tender. And you'll see in the tender, there's a weighting for different standards, for particularly for information security these days. But below that, where there's no market demand, internally an organization where they feel that they're growing, they're having problems maybe with micromanagement, they're having problems with delegating and moving and building teams and so on. And owners find it difficult sometimes, not because they're not willing, but they find it difficult to let go of control of areas that they used to look after everything. Now, as they grow, they're delegating responsibility for different aspects of the business, and they find it hard to let go. So we would work with organizations where it would benefit them in that regard.
And where can people find out more about you, Phil?
Okay, so the website, enableiso.com.
Right.
We've got LinkedIn. You'll find us on the company page.
Yep.
And, I suppose that's about as far as you need to go to get in contact with us.
Fantastic.